Hi, this is Ms. Holly from Olympian High School. We've been learning about Chapter 37 using the Traditions and Encounters textbook. We're going to pick up with this section from the Traditions and Encounters textbook on occupation, collaboration, and resistance. So first, let's just define these terms. Occupation is what happens when the power, whether that's an imperial power in terms of imperialism or in this case a wartime power, occupies that land and administers it. So how do they rule? Collaboration is when you work with someone. In the case of Japan and Germany, it's like working with the Nazis or working with the Japanese. Why would somebody do that? You might ask yourself. And so we'll look at the reasons for why they would do that, and then resistance and different types of resistance. Okay, so the administration, how they governed the areas that were occupied because of the war. So let's say Germany or Japan, when you went in and conquered an area, how do they govern it? How do they rule it? It differed. The answer is it depends. In certain areas, like Manchukuo and in Burma, in Japan, they would install like puppet government. So that's a government that's basically essentially being controlled by the occupying power. Some states, if they worked with the occupying power, might be awarded land and allowed to kind of independently run itself, so long as they were doing things that were in line with what the occupying power wanted. So Thailand, for example, won some territories nearby Laos and Burma. Other places were considered too valuable or too strategic to be left alone, so they were militarily occupied. So areas like Indochina, so Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, Hong Kong, Singapore, Borneo, New Guinea, they're being ruled directly. Um, okay, how they're administered also depends based on if they were seen as racially superior or inferior. So certain areas, for example, by Hitler, were seen as racially valuable, and so they were allowed to continue to rule themselves. For example, Denmark retained its government, Norway and Holland, the Germans left a civilian administration intact. In France, it differed on what part of France you were in, and there was a type of government called the Vichy government that was basically collaborating with the Nazis, whereas they left a civilian government in other parts of France. There are reasons why they collaborated. Some people felt like it was the lesser of two evils. If they didn't collaborate with the Nazis might take over themselves, and then you have to deal with that. And then in places like Eastern Europe and the Balkan countries, you have direct military rule, which, we're going to see all kinds of exploitation of those areas. Speaking of exploitation, how the Japanese and German authorities ruled over these people was to benefit themselves economically. So sometimes that took the form of slave labor to help meet labor shortages. You see work camps producing things for the war industries where people labored under horrific conditions, received very little in the way of sustenance, so food. And the way that people responded to Japanese and German occupation varied. It ran the gamut from being collaborating with the Nazis and the Japanese to acquiescence to open resistance. For most people, they went on with their lives as much as they could. Some parts of Asia, people felt like, well, the Japanese are just another occupying power. Sometimes people joined because they thought it was a means or a way to gain power, that maybe it would benefit them. Sometimes they had the idea that it was better to collaborate than to be occupied militarily by the Nazis or by the Japanese. Others collaborated because they wanted to, prosper financially. There was a financial benefit, or some had an axe to grind. Maybe they had been upset with their neighbor years ago, so they turned their neighbors into the Nazis or to the Japanese. Some parts of Europe were motivated by anti-communist sentiment, so trying to stop the rise of communism. Even in China, there were Chinese members of the Kuomintang, or the KMT, that helped the Japanese and worked with the Japanese. Now, and of course, not everybody did. Many people resisted, and the levels of resistance that we see also range in intensity. Sometimes there was sabotage. There were attempts at assassinations. You have resistance fighters. You have them destroying kinds of munitions and war materiel. So you can read about that. Sometimes they gathered intelligence or helped protect people that the Nazis, the Japanese were hunting. And sometimes there were symbolic types of defiance. So walking out of a bar when the Japanese walk in, or in the Netherlands, where the House of Orange stood for national independence, people would salute traffic lights when they turned orange. There's a movie that, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name right now. I'll think of the name, but there's lots of movies where you see the sort of symbolic standing up to the Nazis. Okay, and within Germany and Japan, people had a really hard time standing up to their state because many of the institutions that could have served as a basis of resistance had already been weakened or abolished by the Japanese and the German Nazis. So labor unions had been outlawed, churches, other political parties destroyed. There were many attempts by people to resist in more organized ways. So there were assassination attempts on Hitler's life. There was an assassination attempt that was successful against the leader of the SS, Reinhard Heydrich. But there was, in retaliation, like mass killing of the village that was associated with the people that assassinated Heydrich. So you can read about that on your own, and then you can also read about what happened to the people that did the failed assassination attempt on Hitler. Hanging from meat hooks. You see similar sorts of response by the Japanese against the Chinese who tried to flee. Again, hanging from their thumbs from the ceilings. Really awful, terrible ways of meting out punishment. Okay, so these types of retaliations against people who were standing up against the Japanese and the Germans only served to further inflame resistance movements. Many people risking their lives to try to stand up against the Japanese and the Germans. The movie I'm thinking of, Casablanca. So you can hear people singing songs, patriotic songs, in defiance of the Germans in that movie. It's a great movie to watch. Okay. We're going to talk about a very topic next, the Holocaust, and I'll see you in that next one.